Why embarrassing memories come back at night? Carl Jung. Carl Jung observed that the psyche does not forget its wounds. It only waits for the moment the ego stops guarding the door. Here is where we begin, with Arthur Schopenhauer, a thinker Jung read closely and returned to across his life, who wrote, "Man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills," from his essay on the freedom of the will, and what he meant is simple and unsettling at once. You can decide to stop thinking about the thing you said 15 years ago. You can decide it with your whole daytime mind, and still, at 11 at night, in the dark, with nothing else demanding your attention, there it is again. The wrong word you said at the funeral, the joke that landed with silence, the letter you should not have sent. Back it comes, uninvited, and Schopenhauer's point lands here, with real weight. You did not choose to summon it, and you cannot simply choose to release it, which tells you something important. This is not a discipline problem. This is not a willpower problem. Something else in you has its own will, and tonight we are going to name it properly. Before we go further, if this kind of teaching helps you understand your own nights a little better, I would love for you to subscribe, so that tomorrow's teaching finds you as easily as this one did. The first key is, the memory returning at night is not randomness. It is a signal. Jung spent years of his early career on something called the word association test, where a patient was given ordinary words, table, mother, money, water, and asked to respond instantly with the first word that came to mind. And while the patient was busy trying to look calm and quick, Jung was holding a stopwatch, because the true data was never the words, it was the delay, a half-second hesitation, a stammer, a flush of the face, a wrong word repeated twice. These were the places where something reached up from underneath and briefly took the wheel. Jung called these disturbances the fingerprints of a complex, and what showed up in the laboratory in daylight is the very same mechanism that shows up in your bed at midnight. You did not decide to relive the embarrassing thing. Some part of you reached up and pulled it forward, the same way it once reached up and slowed your hand on a stimulus word. This is not weakness, and it is not you being dramatic. It is your own psyche running a test you did not schedule. So let me say this quietly to myself. What returns tonight is asking, not accusing. What returns tonight is asking, not accusing. The second key is that reaching hand has a name. Jung called it a complex, and he meant something very specific by the word, not what we mean today when we say someone has a complex about their height or their accent. He meant a cluster of memory, feeling, and image, bound together around a single emotional charge, sitting in the unconscious like a small second personality, with its own energy, its own memory, almost its own will. Jung wrote plainly, "Complexes can have us," from his Collected Works, Volume 8. And notice the direction of that sentence. We assume we have our feelings, that they are ours to command, but Jung is telling you the traffic can run the other way. A complex can have you, can take the wheel for a few seconds or a few hours, and drive you somewhere your conscious intentions never chose. Think about the shape of the embarrassing memory that keeps returning to you. It is rarely your worst sin. It is rarely the most serious thing you have ever done. It is something smaller, sharper, a moment when you were exposed, seen wrongly, caught looking foolish in front of people whose opinion mattered. That specific shape, exposure before others, is almost always the fingerprint of what Jung called a complex organized around image, how you are seen, and it has its own gravity, pulling loose thoughts toward it, the way a magnet pulls iron filings into a pattern. Imagine a man lying awake the night before a dinner party, not rehearsing what he will say tomorrow, but replaying an offhand remark he made at a work gathering 9 years ago, a joke that landed wrong, a silence that followed it. He has since apologized, changed jobs, grown older, and still the scene returns with the same clarity it had the night it happened, because it is not filed under memory the way his address from that year is filed. It is filed under image, under the question his own psyche keeps circling. Was I foolish? Was I exposed? And once a memory is filed there, it stops behaving like an ordinary memory at all. It behaves like a small charged object. drawing other stray thoughts toward it, so that one uncomfortable recollection quietly recruits company, a second embarrassment, a third, all orbiting the same center. This is why the mind so rarely surfaces a random assortment of your past mistakes. It returns again and again to the same handful of scenes, because they share one gravity, one wound, one image under threat. During the day, you have armor against this pull, meetings, tasks, other people's voices. But the complex does not need your permission to exist, it only needs an opening. So I say to myself, this feeling is a part of me, not all of me. This feeling is a part of me, not all of me. The third key is, night itself is the opening, and here is the mechanism plainly. During your waking hours, your ego, the part of you that says I and means it, is spending real energy, holding the persona in place at work, managing your face in traffic, tracking 100 small social calculations, keeping the lid on a dozen minor complexes at once. This takes psychic energy, real energy, the same currency your body spends on digestion or on standing upright. But at night, when the tasks fall away, when the room goes dark and the body lies still, that energy withdraws from its daytime posts. Jung, drawing on the work of the French psychiatrist Pierre Janet, whom he studied closely, described this as a lowering of the threshold of consciousness. The ego's grip loosens, the way a hand loosens in sleep, and what the ego was holding down during the day simply floats up, unguarded. This is not punishment, it is closer to a tide going out and leaving the seabed exposed. The shame you carry did not grow stronger at night, your guard against it grew weaker. That is the whole mechanism. Imagine a man who spends his whole workday being the reliable one, answering calls calmly, smoothing over other people's mistakes, holding his own irritation perfectly out of view. By evening he tells himself he feels fine, even good, because the mask held all day. But the mask holding is not the same as the feeling being gone, it is only postponed. And postponed feeling has to land somewhere. So at 11 that night, lying still, with no phone to answer and no face to manage, the thing he pushed down at 9 that morning finally has room to surface. And it does not arrive as the whole feeling, it arrives disguised as memory, as an old embarrassment from years back, because the psyche often reaches for the nearest available image with a matching charge, rather than showing you the day's raw feeling directly. This explains something you have probably noticed, that the memory rarely arrives when you are busy, distracted, in company. It waits for stillness, the way water waits for a crack in the stone. And stillness is exactly what the ego cannot maintain its guard through forever. Jung wrote, in Ion, when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside, as fate. And there is a popular paraphrase of that same line that circulates online. You will call it fate. Worth knowing is a paraphrase. Not his exact words, but even in his own words the direction is the same. What you do not face inwardly finds a way to happen to you. And at night, with the ego's daytime scaffolding down, the inner situation stops waiting politely and simply happens. Right there, behind your closed eyes. Not because you are weak, but because you are, for a few hours, finally undefended. So my resolve tonight is, I will let the light come without gripping it. I will let the light come without gripping it. The fourth key is, this autonomous quality of the complex is not theory. Jung watched it happen in front of him. In a case from his early work, using the association method, a small sum of money, 70 francs, had gone missing from a household, and Jung ran the test on the people involved, using ordinary stimulus words. And one person's responses to certain words connected to money and to secrecy came back slow, tangled, and strange. Hesitations where there should have been none, and when Jung pointed this out, gently, without accusation, the person confessed, the theft had happened. And here is the detail that matters most. The person had not simply lied and gotten away with it cleanly. Some part of their own psyche had betrayed them under the stopwatch, had refused to cooperate with the cover story the conscious mind was trying to maintain. The complex tied to the guilt was strong enough to override the will's attempt to appear calm, and this is worth slowing down on, because we tend to imagine the will as a single ruler sitting on a single throne, giving orders that the rest of us simply obeys. But Jung's data said otherwise. The will gave an order: act normal, answer smoothly, and a second authority in the same house quietly refused to salute. That refusal showed up as a half-second of silence, a stumble, a wrong word, small things, almost nothing, and yet enough to expose the whole arrangement. Now bring this down from the laboratory into an ordinary week. Imagine a man sitting at a family dinner, years after a small humiliation nobody else even remembers. Someone mentions, in passing, the name of the town where it happened, and before he has decided to react at all, his stomach tightens, his sentence trails off, he reaches for his glass, instead of finishing his thought. Nobody at the table notices anything more than a brief pause, but he notices, and later that night, lying in bed, the whole scene returns uninvited. The same way Jung's patient's hand hesitated over a stimulus word, that dinner table pause was the fingerprint, the proof that something was reached and touched, a moment before his conscious mind caught up to explain it away. This is the same force at work when your face grows warm, remembering something years old. When your own body reacts before your mind has decided to react. The complex does not ask your permission, and it does not follow your timetable. It has its own timing, entirely separate from what you have planned for the evening, or for the rest of your life for that matter. And this is worth sitting with, because so many people treat these night returns as a moral failing, as if a disciplined mind would simply not think about that anymore, as if enough willpower, enough distraction, enough time should have closed the door for good by now. But discipline was never the right tool here. You cannot outwill a complex the way you can outwill a bad habit of biting your nails, because the complex is not a habit sitting quietly under your control waiting to be corrected. It is closer to a separate center of gravity, inside the larger system of you, with its own memory, its own timing, its own small vote in how your evening goes. Jung's stopwatch in that old study measured milliseconds, but the principle it revealed has no expiry date. Whether it is a half-second delay over a word in a quiet office in the early 1900s, or a grown man's stomach tightening at a dinner table decades after the fact, the mechanism is identical. Something below the threshold of the ego reached up and answered before you could stop it. And once you see that this has always been the pattern, not weakness, not failure of character, but the visible fingerprint of an autonomous complex doing exactly what Jung's own patients demonstrated under careful observation, the shame around it starts to loosen just slightly. Because you are no longer fighting a mysterious defect in yourself, you are recognizing a documented feature of the psyche. One Jung measured with an actual clock in his hand. So I remind myself, my hesitation is information, not failure. My hesitation is information, not failure. The fifth key is the one to sit with longest, because now we turn the lens from other people's stories to your own pillow. Tonight, or some night this week, a particular memory will surface again, and the question worth asking is not why does my mind do this to me? The question is why this one? Out of every embarrassing thing that has happened to you across your whole life, why does the psyche keep returning to this specific scene and not another? Jung's answer would be that the complex forms around whatever memory carries the highest emotional charge relative to your own particular sense of who you are supposed to be. And that phrase, who you are supposed to be, is really another name for the persona, the mask Jung described as necessary, negotiated with the world, worn so we can move through offices and dinners and family gatherings without exposing every raw nerve we carry. The mask itself is not the problem. Jung was never against the mask. The problem begins the moment we forget it is a mask and quietly start mistaking it for the whole of our identity. And once that mistake is made, anything that cracks the mask, even for 1 second, even 15 years ago, registers somewhere deep as a genuine emergency, not a social embarrassment only, but a threat to the very story you have been telling yourself about yourself. Imagine a man who has spent 20 years building a quiet reputation as the reliable one, the one who never drops the ball, the one colleagues call when something needs to be handled without fuss, and one afternoon, in a meeting that everyone else has long forgotten, he mispronounces a client's name twice, stumbles over a figure he should have known, and sees, just for a moment, a flicker of amusement cross someone's face. Nothing happened that day that changed his career, nothing that anyone else remembers by the following week, and yet 15 years later, that afternoon is the one his mind keeps returning to at midnight. Not the year he actually did make a costly mistake, not the argument he lost his temper in, but this small, forgettable stumble, and if you ask him why, he will not know. He will only say it is embarrassing. But Jung would ask a sharper question. He would ask what image of himself that stumble threatened. And the honest answer, once he sits with it, is that the whole architecture of his self-worth had been built on being the one who does not stumble. So a 5-second flicker of amusement on a stranger's face, registered, somewhere below conscious thought, as a small earthquake in the foundation of who he believed himself to be. That is why it still has voltage. That is why it survived while larger, more serious failures faded quietly into the general blur of the past. The size of the original event was never the point. The size of the crack in the persona was the point. And this pattern holds true whichever mask a person happens to be wearing. Imagine instead a woman who has built her sense of herself around warmth, around being the one who makes everyone feel welcome, easy, cared for. For her, the memory that will not leave her alone at night will not be some dramatic cruelty, it will be the one dinner party where she was tired and short with someone, the one time she forgot to ask after a friend's mother, the one small, selfish moment that, to everyone else in the room, meant absolutely nothing, but to her, meant that the mask had slipped and something less flattering had shown through underneath. Notice the pattern in both cases. The wound is almost never about the event, as the outside world would judge it. The event is small, forgettable, ordinary. What makes it unforgettable to the person carrying it is that it cracked the specific persona they had built their identity around. And every one of us has built one, the composed one, the generous one, the competent one, the strong one, the good one. And every one of those masks has its own particular vulnerability, its own specific way it can be cracked. So before we move to what to actually do with this, sit with the honest question. When you review your own recurring midnight memory, do not ask what did I do wrong. Ask instead, what did that moment prove about me that I was desperate not to be true? What image of myself was standing behind me in that room, quietly begging not to be seen falling? That answer, once you find it, will tell you far more about the mask you are wearing right now, today, than any compliment you have ever received could tell you. And here is the useful turn. This was never really about the past event at all. The event is over, unreachable, unchangeable. What is not over is the story of yourself you are currently protecting, the persona you are still, this week, quietly defending. So I ask myself gently, what image of myself was this shame protecting? What image of myself was this shame protecting? The sixth key is what to actually do with all of this. And it is quieter than most people expect, because the instinct, when a shameful memory surfaces at night, is to fight it, to argue with it, to tell yourself firmly that it does not matter, that no one remembers, that you have grown since then. And none of that is false. Exactly. But none of it works either, because you cannot out-argue an autonomous complex with daytime logic. It does not live in the part of you that processes arguments. It lives lower than that, in the same layer that made your hand hesitate on the stimulus word. And arguing with it from above is like shouting instructions down a well and expecting the water to rearrange itself. Imagine a man who lies awake most Tuesdays, reliving a meeting from years ago, where he was asked a direct question in front of colleagues and simply did not know the answer, and the silence stretched, and someone else answered for him, gently, kindly even, and that kindness somehow made it worse. For years his method has been the same. He tells himself firmly that it was nothing, that no one else remembers, that he has since proven himself many times over, and every single time, the memory nods politely and returns the following week regardless, because he has been negotiating with it as if it were a rational visitor who could be reasoned into leaving, when in fact it is closer to a child standing at the door who has not yet been asked what it actually wants. Jung's own practice, and later that of the analysts who trained under him, offers something different. Not confrontation, but a kind of respectful review. When the memory surfaces, rather than pushing it away or spiraling inside it, you can simply ask it questions, as you would ask a visitor who arrived uninvited but clearly has something to say. What are you trying to show me? What did this event teach me about what I fear being seen as? When did I first decide this must never happen again? This is what some call a trigger post-mortem, done gently, in a journal, or simply in the quiet of your own mind before sleep. Not therapy, not a diagnosis, just an honest conversation with the part of you that keeps knocking. And notice the shift in posture this requires. You are no longer standing at the door trying to keep it shut. You are opening it part way and asking what it came to say. For the man reliving the meeting, this might mean finally admitting, in that private review, that the fear was never really about looking uninformed. It was about the old belief that he must always be the one with the answer, or he has no value in the room at all. Once he names that belief plainly, the memory has less work left to do. It has already delivered its message, and a message delivered stops needing to knock again quite so loudly. Here is what tends to happen when people do this consistently. The charge around the memory begins to lower, not because the memory becomes untrue, it happened, it will always have happened, but because the complex loses some of its isolation, some of its autonomy, when it is met with attention instead of avoidance. Jung believed that what the ego refuses to face keeps its full charge precisely because it is refused. The moment you turn toward it, even partially, even with trembling hands, some of that energy returns to ordinary circulation, rather than surfacing uninvited at midnight. This is close to what Jung meant by individuation, not becoming perfect, not erasing your embarrassing history, but becoming whole enough to hold your own full story. The composed version and the version that cried at the gathering, the generous version and the version that was petty once, the confident version and the version that did not know the answer, held together, not as contradiction, but as completeness. A person who can look at their own worst midnight memory and say plainly, "Yes, that happened, and I am still here," carries a very different night than a person still spending energy trying to keep that memory locked outside the door. And there is a further comfort in this. Once you have asked the memory its questions a few times, honestly, without flinching away halfway through, you may notice it visits less often, not because you defeated it, but because it was never trying to punish you in the first place. It was only ever trying to be heard. Complexes, Jung taught, do not usually want war, they want acknowledgement, and a psyche that has been heard has far less reason to interrupt your sleep than one that has spent 15 years being silenced at the door. So if tonight the old scene visits you again, you do not have to win an argument with it. You only have to let it speak once, fully, without rushing to defend yourself, and then let it go back to sleep. So I close with this. I will let the old scene teach me once more. I will let the old scene teach me once more. Here is the whole picture. The memory that returns at night is not randomness. It is a